Welcome back to Celebrity Radio. It's Alex Belfield talking to some of the most interesting people and a man who's got a brand new book out. He spent 4 years writing it. The Spring of Kasper Meier is written by Ben Fergusson. He joins us on the phone right now. How are you?
Very well, thank you very much. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very good. And congratulations on this new book. It's not very often you get this much hype with a first book. People seem to like it. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I'm very much enjoying it. It's obviously when you write the book, you don't... you hope to get it published, but you don't particularly think about what's going to happen after it's been published, and so it's a very fun time at the moment.
Some people rattle these out in a few weeks and then just throw it into the publisher. You spent a long time writing this. Tell us the story of it. Written over 4 years, wasn't it?
So it was something I started writing in about 2008, It was probably written over about 4 years, but that's not obviously 4 years of just writing. That's lots of research, because it's a historical novel. It's set in Berlin in 1946, just after the war. And then obviously the writing of the first draft probably took only about a year. But then after that, many extra years of redrafting it, re-editing it, reworking it. And I also have had a full-time job since I left university, so it's also squeezing it around that. So, about 4 years in end to end.
I know you're interested in art. That, of course, is your big passion and what you've done for most of your life. Why this book, though, and why this subject?
Well, I moved to Berlin. I lived in Berlin for about 4 years, although I'm now back in London. And I was very inspired by the history of the city. And it's a city that is very marked by its past. There are still bullet holes in the walls. There are still big sections of the city that are just missing, either because of the Berlin Wall or because of the bombing during the war. And so you become very aware of this. The old people around you have this sort of experience, this sort of major event. But unlike in the UK, where for me, and I'm sure for you and lots of British people, your grandparents talk a lot about what happened to them in the war. That you get almost too many war stories. In Germany and in Berlin, you hear nothing about it because it's obviously a very sensitive subject. So you really hear very little about people's war experiences, and therefore, to a writer, anything that's sort of not being said is very fascinating.
The heart of this story is that it's heartbreaking and it's a story of love and loss, really, isn't it? How hard is that to sort of put into words? It's easy to tell a story, especially if it's personal, and make it heartfelt, but when it's somebody else's story, that must be tricky. You've done a great job of that. Was that easy, or was that really the tough bit and the reason it took so long?
Thank you, first of all. That is the tough bit. I think, and I think that is something, one does read novels where, the setting is very good or the plot's very good, but there isn't much of a sort of emotional pull. And for me, that always leaves me a bit cold. So I was very keen that, although it's an exciting book and a book with a plot, hopefully, it's at the heart of the book is the relationship between Kasper Meier, who's this older 50-year-old black market trader, and Eva, who's this much younger rubber woman. So their friendship is very much the heart of the book. And the book opens, it doesn't give too much away, with her blackmailing him. And I was just really interested in the idea of this, of how a friendship can develop from a very bad start. And so, it was a big worry of mine of whether I could get that transition to work from them obviously being enemies in a sense to becoming friends, and becoming and that friendship helping them deal with what had happened to them both during the war and afterwards. That was what was being worked on in lots of the redrafts, was getting that right and getting it right in a way that feels real and doesn't feel too sentimental.
I don't know how you feel about it, Ben. We're exactly the same age, and for us and our generation, I think we see the war differently than our parents, and certainly their parents who were involved in it. For us, the mystique of it and the stories that we read about it are so moving and so compelling. Is that initially where your interest came? I mean, we can't see it in a first hand. We didn't live through it, and nor did we experience sort of the impact of it in terms of money and how people struggled. We've been very blessed, our generation, in a way, possibly too blessed, some would argue. Do you think that's why our generation are so interested now, because we're sort of viewing it through different eyes?
Yeah, I think there are two things. I think that's definitely part of it. I think although we didn't grow up with it, and although we're, in a sense, my parents weren't in the war, my grandparents were, but it's still very much a part of what it means to be British or what it means to be German. It's still very affected by that war. It's arguably still the biggest tragedy or the most important historical event that happened in living memory. So I think it continues to be very important. Certainly for me, both of my grandparents met during the war because of the war. So I, like many people of my generation, I'm only here because of that war. And of course that then, also drives, my interest in it. And the other reason that it's a perennial topic for writing is it's very dramatic, and it created lots of dramatic contrasts, and because, and again, the reason that my grandparents had lots of war stories is because it was a very dramatic time where life was very precious, and all of the drama of our daily lives was heightened in those very short years.
I also wonder then why the youth of Germany aren't as fascinated by it as we are in the same way. It's interesting you say they're not talking about it like their parents didn't, and certainly their parents' parents didn't. Is there no sort of sea of change there? Are they still sort of sweeping it under the carpet and not acknowledging it or talking about it?
It's not the case that they sweep it under the carpet. It's the case that they are very, and rightly so in many ways, still feel a huge amount of you still have a huge amount of concern and guilt about what happened in their name during the war. It's some of the biggest atrocities in human history. And so, but I do think what's happening, and in a sense this book is part of that, is looking at actually how there are writers looking at how lives were lived after the war and during the war in a slightly more complex way. And you do see films and books that are starting to deal with that. But again, in terms of people's personal experiences, they didn't hear that. So my partner, for instance, is German, and that's the reason I moved to Germany. But his granddad had one arm, for instance. And no one knew I had one arm. They knew it was something to do with the war, but it just wasn't discussed. And so he didn't grow up with anyone talking about the war. It was just... So it's not necessarily that our generation in Germany aren't interested in the war, don't discuss the war, but it's just that was never shared with them as a generation.
That's fascinating. And let's move on to you, because what an achievement it is to get a book published. Everybody wants their own book released by a big company, and you've managed to achieve that. I know you're on your book tour at the moment. I mean, you've worked in art for many years. You've edited and you've published and you've sort of been around this sort of thing, but you've never done it under your own name. And to get taken up and to have such a big publisher behind you must be a great thrill.
It's a huge thrill, yeah. I mean, I remember a few years ago, sort of, when I was writing the book, thinking about where I'd like it to go, and thinking, the main thing that's important to me is to get it published by someone. And I wasn't particularly thinking about a big publisher, and it's been sold in a few other countries, and I absolutely wasn't thinking about translations and things like that. So it's been wonderful the last couple of years, and slightly sort of dreamlike. It's hugely exciting. It's something I wanted to do since I was a little kid, and there's something very special about something you worked hard for, coming true. And I do think, in terms of other writers, or other people thinking about writing or wanting to get published, I think there's a huge amount to be said for perseverance. I think the reason it's happening now, I've been trying to write books or writing stories and writing different things for well over 10 years. And when I was at university, I studied English, and a lot of other people were also writing, and now are not. And the difference really is that I was one of the few who stuck with it. So I think that's the message. So that's definitely how you get there. It's just sticking with it.
So how much is it luck in getting published, and how much is it perseverance, and how much is it talent? What's that ratio then? I've tried to work it out, because when I do these interviews, it seems like if you're Katie Price, you're never going to have a problem having your 14th autobiography published. But if you're somebody with a great novel, it's much, much more difficult, isn't it?
It is more difficult, although I do think having a great novel gets you most of the way there. I remember having a chat to my agent about this, that you hear these statistics, that their agency, she will receive about 100 manuscripts a week, and how, and one has this feeling of like, if they're taking on 3 clients a year, how do you possibly compete? But chatting to her about it, she said that 99% of those books are not very good books. And so I think you have to write a good book first, and you have to finish a book. I mean, she also gets lots of things that aren't finished. So writing and finishing a good book will get you half the way there, I think.
Congratulations on this new book. It's out now. It's called The Spring of Kasper Meier. It's by Ben Fergusson. It's in your stores now, and it's very moving, and it's very thrilling, and it's got a great heart to it. Congratulations, and thanks for talking to me, Ben.
Thank you so much for having me.